Hello everyone, you know me, I'm Taimur Rahman and I'm here with Things Chak. Sorry, mispronounced your name. I'm going to murder a couple of Chinese pronunciations today.
You don't want to hear my Urdu.
No, you'll forgive me, okay? And you can feel free to murder any Urdu that you want to. I'm quite alright with that, nothing so is our audience. Knowing that you're from China and you live in Beijing, is that right?
That's right.
And you are an artist. With the hand, with the pencil, and with the pen, and with colors, etc. And you're also the art director for the Tricontinental, and you are part of a collective known as the Dongsheng. Is that no? That's wrong. How do you say it again?
Dongshang.
Dongshang. You are part of a collective, which is the Dongshang, which conveys a lot of very important information about China today to the world via the internet, etc. So that's a great resource to look at, etc. And just to clarify to everyone here that Things Chak is not with any organization, a political party as such. She's not with the Communist Party of China, so her views are entirely her own, and those are her individual views. All right, Things, so let's get down to it. China is making a very serious investment into Pakistan. That's called the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. It's to the tune of about $62 billion, perhaps even more. And although the Pakistani government thinks that this can be a major basis for the rejuvenation of the economy of Pakistan and will get us out of economic troubles, there are also lots of critics of this entire CPEC, as it's called, which is part of the One Belt, One Road initiative. One phrase that we have heard increasingly within Pakistan is that China is going to be the new East India, or the Chinese are going to play the role of the East India Company. So we want inevitably to move to that. But to start our conversation, I think we should perhaps start by understanding what is China, what is modern China, how did it come about, and where is it heading? So I wanted to start our conversation by asking you about China in the 19th century, what is referred to as a century of humiliation. Could you walk us through that? What is that exactly, and how do the Chinese feel about that?
No, I think it's a good question. It's a question that I feel very personally about because where I'm born and where my family's from is Hong Kong.
Okay.
And a lot of this story begins there. Hong Kong was ceded during this imperialist incursion led by the British, which we call the Opium Wars. It really was an imperialist incursion in the sense that, China had quite protectionist policies at that time and didn't want to open freely its markets to foreign powers.
Who was selling opium?
Was selling opium. So opium was the trick. And we say opium of the masses, indeed, that was what? An opium that was, planted in India and basically forced down, the hands of the Chinese people.
And this was in 1842
exactly.
and 45, 46.
That's right. And during that war, really it was one of the gunboat diplomacy we hear about, and also basically putting the entire population, or a large part of the population, under addiction and all kinds of what we call as unfair treaties, which include the ceding of Hong Kong as a territory.
And Macau.
And Macau. Macau actually came before because it was a Portuguese colony for almost 500 years.
Oh, really? Okay.
And my mom is actually from Macau, so
okay.
I come from the really colonial parts of China.
Interesting.
So over 156 years, remember that Hong Kong was only returned back to China in 1997, only 25 years ago.
Right.
And so during the 19th century, China, under the sort of imperialist forces, really saw a big decline. It was also the end of a declining Qing dynasty, which is the last imperial dynasty of China. And just to get a sense, at the beginning of the 19th century, China was the largest global economy. By the time of the end of the Second World War, basically when the PRC, the People's Republic of China, was founded in 1949, it was only about 5% of the global GDP. You can see that 100 years of humiliation, roughly speaking, had a huge toll on the economic conditions, on the social conditions of that year. Of course, that century, Of course, that century wasn't also marked just by Western imperialist powers. Okay. We have, of course, the rise of a fascist Japanese empire that really touched so many parts of our region here in Asia.
They took over Taiwan, Burma, Korea,
Exactly.
and then northern China.
So during this period, and sometimes I think in a kind of Western revisionist version of World War II history, they only focus on the European part.
That's true.
But there was actually a whole other battlefront
course.
in the Asian side.
With millions of deaths.
Millions of deaths.
Yeah.
So in China, we call it actually the 14-year war of resistance against Japanese.
Starting in 1932-33 or so.
That's right. So this is why that history was quite apparent, in everyone's mind living today. Because in China, about 20 million people lost their lives during this, fighting Japanese fascism.
That's nearly 40% of the overall people who died in World War II as a whole.
Yes.
Was in China alone.
So, a lot of people have forgotten that, the Soviet Union also, the 27 million Soviet lives were lost to fight against fascism, but also 20 million Chinese lives.
So really the century of humiliation is more like a century and a half of humiliation in the sense that it only comes to an end with the end of World War II, perhaps.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Well, I mean, this is why I think for a lot of people to understand the Taiwan question and why is that so important, it is still a process of national unification. Remember, Taiwan, having been ceded in an earlier period, also with the Japanese, was under Japanese rule for 50 years. Then kind of de facto was a bit of a U.S. military base and has had a difficult history, but it's still part of this longer arc of,
Breaking up China.
Breaking up China and reunifying China.
And perhaps it's very important to mention that mainland China itself had been bifurcated into several zones where in one zone the French were operating, in another the British, etc., through various warlords, etc.
Yes. So this is why Mao Zedong's analysis then was that China was a semi-feudal, semi-colonial society.
Okay.
So where I used to live in Shanghai, there are still areas called the French Concession or the International Settlement. So that was basically already cut up by different foreign imperialist powers controlling the areas.
And you also had the Portuguese, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, in Macau.
And you had, did you also have the Germans?
Germans, yes, in Qingdao.
Right.
Yes.
And did you also have the Spanish at any level?
Spanish, no.
Not so much.
Yeah,
Okay.
they missed out.
So, so how did then China get beyond that? And now we hear that China is one of the most advanced countries. It's going to perhaps has already, in terms of purchasing power parity, overtaken the United States of America. If that's not the case, and certainly in terms of nominal GDP, it's also the second largest economy in the world. So obviously that all is now behind you. How did that happen?
I mean,
in your opinion?
We had a communist revolution.
Right. Yes.
And in 1949, when the PRC was founded, I was just mentioning it was 5% of the global economy. It was in a very weak state.
Right.
It had been devastated through this imperialist incursions, fighting a fascist war, and also civil war against the nationalists, the KMT. So it was a very weak state. But if we look from that level and how it arrived to become the second largest economy, or as you rightly say, the largest economy in PPP terms, from at 1949 being the 12th poorest country in the world by GDP per capita terms.
12th poorest in the world.
Yes, 2 Asian countries and 8 African countries were poorer. Sorry, 11th poorest.
Wow.
11th poorest.
A country that had also witnessed a devastating world war that left 20 million people dead.
Yes.
And was the 11th poorest in the world.
Yes.
That's the base from which it started.
Yes.
But a lot of people are prone to ascribe the newfound wealth of China to the reforms of the Deng Xiaoping period. Whereas when I asked you, you said, well, we had a communist revolution. So I think people are not aware, how does, what impact did that revolution have such that you achieved the modernization? Or did it? Or was it that purely that the development of China took place after 78? What is the case?
I know that a lot of people, after 1978, during the Deng Xiaoping period, the opening up reform, kind of think, especially in the left, have an understanding that China went the capitalist road and kind of, left behind the socialist path. But I think we have to understand the process of socialist modernization, that the path that China took, went through distinct phases. So during the Mao period, during the 29 years he was in power, we have to look at the huge gains that were made.
Which were what?
So, for example, from the level of the people's life, life expectancy nearly doubled in the 3 decades or more or less. So in 1949, the average life expectancy of a Chinese person was 35 years.
Really?
By the end of Mao Zedong's leadership, it was almost 70. So it basically
That's a
doubled.
dramatic
About
transformation.
68, I believe.
That's a dramatic
So,
transformation.
you know, life expectancy is an interesting metrics because it actually captures a lot of social conditions and economic factors. It's not just how much money people have, it's access to education, it's about the question of gender, access to healthcare, basic healthcare, and a variety of other factors that are embedded in environmental conditions
of course.
too.
Everything.
Yeah,
Kind
so
of rolled into one.
exactly.
But you know, I mean, people like Francis Dakota, etc., have said, well, Mao is the biggest totalitarian mass murderer of all of history. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, I mean, they claim that there are more than, or about 60 million, what do they call it, early deaths or something in China. Is that really the case? And do the people of China think of Mao as a mass murderer?
You know, so the general evaluation of Mao's presidency and leadership is that there's no sense that, you know, any leader is perfect.
Okay.
So the common sense we say is 70% really good
Yes.
to 30%.
Yes, that's a
really
phrase
good
Mao
as-
himself has used.
Yes. So in the process of building socialism, you know, one day you win. As workers and peasants seize the state. How do you build a society under such difficult conditions? There's no guidebook. There's no path.
Sure.
It's, as Lenin likes to say, the zigs and zags.
Of course.
And so let's not also have rose-tinted glasses to think
Fair
about,
enough.
you know, the socialist utopia. There's
Fair
a lot of learning, and I think there's actually something that I hope more people can understand is the capacity of the party to the CPC to be able to recognize mistakes, reform, constantly sort of test, reassess, mistakes, learn, and it's actually a quite scientific process, and it's a process that's very adaptive to the conditions. China has not stayed stagnant, and that's throughout all the complicated phases. But that being said, in terms of the question of the mass murderer, I mean, in a way, I think when we look at the 5,000 years of history of China, especially for, you know, the working poor, the peasantry, it has been for centuries or millennia a fight against poverty, a fight against hunger, a fight against the countless famines because of the feudalism that we were living in, because of the warlordism, because of imperialism. So when you think about even during the century of humiliation, the millions and millions of people that died, that's something I wish we could kind of have a tally of, you know, the death rate of people living under capitalism or imperialism or feudalism, as opposed to, you know, the victims, so-called victims of communism, right? But of course, that's a convenient way of telling history in some ways. But I think using that point about birth rate, not birth rate, but the life expectancy, I mean, it's hard to explain how life expectancy doubled if it was just a mass genocidal
No, that's not possible.
dictatorship.
The numbers don't add up.
They don't add up.
At all.
At all.
Yeah. And how do the Chinese people today perceive Mao? Do they perceive him as kind of the father of modern China, to use a largely patriarchal expression, but as the founder of modern China? Is that how they perceive him, or is it somewhere else?
The founder of the modern China, I think, would still be Sun Yat-sen.
Okay.
Because he was really, you know, brought
started
forward the new, you know, end of the Qing dynasty,
Right.
and bringing of the Republican period, and in a way, of course, New China would be under the leadership.
That's
of
very
Mao.
interesting. That's very interesting.
So New China being the period after the Communist Revolution, and I would say that it really depends, you know. There's been an interesting way for amongst young people, especially those who were born after the 1990s, of a kind of recovery of the Maoist period, the early socialist period. The last few years, the selected works of Mao Zedong have been bestsellers in China.
Bestsellers?
Yes, so
Really?
young people are going back and reading.
How interesting.
There's a lot of films, TV series going back into this early socialist period. So there is a sort of, let's say, I don't know if it's a revival, but a very present understanding of Mao period and what that has. And of course, that's linked to the leadership of Xi Jinping.
I see.
Of also recovering at this stage of history around the contributions of Mao. We talked about the people's life, you know, education, women's rights, but also building industrial base that was necessary so that the conditions were there for the opening up reform period that Deng Xiaoping led.
Very interesting. Let's move forward. All right, as fascinating as this discussion is, especially with respect to art and literature and movies and film and popular culture. I know you have a lot to contribute, and we'll do a separate session on
Sure.
entirely just the new cinema of China, because
Great.
I think you have quite a bit of knowledge and information on that could be really quite interesting for our viewers. But for the moment, I want to proceed to some of the economic questions,
Sure.
especially pertaining to Pakistan, because I think a lot of people will be interested in that. So in '78, there's the reforms, and people often think that China became capitalist, but you're saying that's really not necessarily the case, and you want to make the case perhaps that China is still socialist. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay,
I
explain
mean,
that to me.
Fundamentally, what happened, evaluation, the assessment, of Deng in 1978 was that China was isolated from the international economic order. China still was as much as the early socialist period had been able to develop in many ways, it still lacked a huge amount of the, capital, technological know-how, to be able to develop the productive forces for a country of that size.
And also, you were isolated from the Soviet Union by that time.
Absolutely. So there was a kind of decision that there needed to be a way to be able to access the capital, but also knowledge, technology, to help develop, because this is the primary stage of socialism that the country is still in. You
Okay.
can't kind of skip stages, you can't sort of fast forward before your time, before the country is ready to do that.
And now, it seems though, that the Communist Party of China is suggesting that China is entering into the advanced stage of socialism.
Yes.
So this was the primitive stage, and you kind of use capitalism for the benefit of industrialization. So what are some of the signs that now things are changing again under Xi Jinping?
So I'll just say one thing in terms of how capital was introduced.
Okay.
In China, we have capitalists, but we don't have capitalism. I think that's a very important distinction.
Is very interesting.
Because capitalists do not have political power.
I see.
There isn't the lobbying forces that you see that buy liberal Western democracies.
Wait. I have to understand this, because we've read that there are many capitalists and billionaires who are part of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, but you're saying they don't have power.
They don't have power as a class to enact or to impact policy.
I see.
That's just not how the country works and the political system works.
I see.
However, what has happened, there are also contradictions that emerge during the period of opening up reform.
Naturally.
Because a lot of people like to quote Deng to say, let a few get rich first. But conveniently, they leave out the second part of what he said, which is that let a few get rich first, so then they have to lift the rest of the people up.
Okay. Prosperity for all.
Yes. But at the first is that, okay, we are not going to be able to develop whole scale the country in the same way. So we have to use our strategic advantages. Develop the eastern coasts, the port cities, develop industrialism in those areas.
Okay.
Create special economic zones, do experiments with that.
Okay.
And in this phase now, in terms of having the eastern region developed much more, we've arrived at, especially in the beginning of the Xi Jinping presidency in 2013, is a recognition that there are lots of advancements during the economic reform and opening up, but there were some inequalities that emerged. We know that, for example, the Gini coefficient, the inequality in China really did increase.
It did, yes.
At the same time, we gained a lot of billionaires, hundreds of them,
Sure.
that we created the world's largest middle class. So we have a middle class of 400 million people. So the economic base was also being lifted for the vast majority of people.
850 million people lifted out of poverty is no joke.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So since 1976, 850 million people. And if we look at in global terms, that is a contribution of 76% of the world's reduction in poverty.
Yeah.
So that's a contribution to humanity.
That's phenomenal.
So coming to the Xi Jinping phase. Okay, so there are some contradictions around inequality, not just between the rich and poor, between the cities and the countryside, but also between regions. We have the highly developed eastern regions, but the western and central regions were still relatively underdeveloped. You have corruption. At the time of 2013, that was a serious problem affecting all levels of society. In fact, the first speech that Xi Jinping gave when he assumed the position of being General Secretary of the party was that we are going to go after not only the flies, but the tigers.
Okay.
And so in the last 10 years...
So it's not just the small cops, but
yes,
the
not
big
just,
fish.
okay, let someone take the bait, or, you know, and we are talking about people who have been members of the Politburo, many members of the Central Committee, former ministers, heads of state banks.
Wow.
We
they
have
all fell.
Many people.
Wow.
And has been and I would say if you talk to an average person in China and the confidence that they feel and the seriousness of the party in dealing with some of the, let's say, the dark sides of what emerged during this period, anti-corruption is by far one of the top things that they credit, saying, okay, we've seen a difference in life.
Wow.
We've seen this is serious. So that's one thing. Other thing is that there was still poverty.
Absolute poverty.
Absolute poverty. So the assessment was in about 2013, there were still 100 million people in China living in extreme poverty, mostly in the countryside.
Okay.
So that's when we enter a campaign led by Xi called the Targeted Poverty Alleviation Campaign.
I see.
Which is an incredible experience for a variety of reasons, because it was a mass mobilization of all sectors of society. You have not only the party, but you have the government institutions, you have the education institutions, you have the doctors, the nurses, the teachers, you have private capital, you have a variety of areas that were involved in the way that China is able to mobilize, because it is a socialist country, it's able to mobilize society in that way. To then go to every poor village in the countryside, initially said 800,000 cadre from the party, to knock on every door, to understand which are the conditions to be able to basically plan an exit out of extreme poverty for every single family.
This sounds like an old style Mao campaign. Door to door.
Door to door.
Go meet with poor people and solve their problems.
Yes, mass line.
Mass line.
And in many ways, one of the weaknesses during the opening and reform period is there was a weakening of the party presence in the base level.
I see.
And so this, and I think very smartly, was a reactivation of the party in the countryside, reactivation of the mass line, and also reestablishing the trust that people have. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party has a very high approval rating, you know.
I've read that.
Even by Harvard standards, you know, they did a study of looking at 2003 to 2016, interviewing 30,000 people across the country in all different levels of government. And Harvard is putting forward, said that for the central government there is 93%.
93%.
And this is not, you know, Chinese state media. This is Harvard.
But all right. Let me throw in, you know,
sure,
a wrench into the works.
Yes.
Many people argue, especially in the West and in other parts of the world, that that's only because there are no choices in China. There's no real debate in China. Everybody just has to follow the party. It's a dictatorship.
Yeah.
Is that how China works?
You know, this question I get asked a lot. And sometimes it's interesting because imagine, I guess 1.4 billion, everything in China is big.
Right.
You know, the numbers are inconceivable. But I mean, if you think you can rule a country of 1.4 billion people with just an iron fist, I mean, that's just impossible.
It doesn't happen that way?
It just it's not possible. And
so how does it work then?
So I'll give you an example. Let's talk about the poverty alleviation campaign, because I think it's an interesting example of how a central government policy gets all the way down to the grassroots and actually gets implemented. And I would say how the actual grassroots democratic processes work. So I said already that 800,000 people were sent to countryside to assess the situation. Then afterwards, 3 million cadre were sent to the villages to live and work with every family. So I actually had a chance to go to some of the rural regions and talk to party members, peasants, women, youth, and to understand the experience.
And you've written a short book on it as well.
Yes, exactly. So people can check that out on Tricontinental site. It's for free.
Great.
And then there's a whole process of what is called democratic appraisal, where you get the communities together, where they discuss everyone's situations, each other's families, who is it living in poverty, you know, how many, cattle do you have, how many ducks do you have.
That much detail.
That much detail. And there's also a voting process even for determining when a family has really exited out of poverty, have they fallen back into poverty, because that has been, since the new China has developed, that level on the grassroots has been essential, because you have to, like you said, Mao knew that you have to be with the people, know and listen to the will of the people and meet the real demands of the people, or they will turn against you. I mean, China has a long history of mass revolt, peasant revolts.
Of course.
It's a country, it's a culture in us.
Boxer Rebellion.
Rebellion, right?
Yes, yes,
I mean, we wouldn't have had a communist revolution without it. So there's sometimes this perception that we're all docile and just, keep our head down, follow the party, but that's very far
That's a good point.
from the truth.
I mean, you have an entire arc from 1911 to 49, really.
Yes, absolutely. And then from those levels, and maybe I'll just, this is kind of since we're talking at the local village level, is actually the first two levels of government in what we call the People's Congresses are actually directly voted by members in the communities.
I see.
And a lot of people don't realize that there's actually levels of direct voting in the base levels.
Right.
Then you elect for your, those base levels are elected through voting. And then those representatives elect the higher, the provincial level, and then elect the central level, and so on and so
In
forth.
a huge country like China, so you basically have layers of people electing all the way to the top.
Absolutely. And I'll give an example. We just had the 20th National Congress of the CPC back in November, and we have about 3,000 delegates that go representing the party. And in order for those 3,000 people to go and represent all their constituencies, it is a process of over a year of nominations from all your different work units. There's interviews, there's examinations, there's rigorous process of people giving inputs, public input, to be able to say that this candidate will represent starting at the village level, then to the county level, then to the provincial level, and et cetera, et cetera. It is a very rigorous process of engagement.
All right. So thank you so much for that entire history lesson on China. And there's lots of details there that we can go into, but I think let's skip ahead, given the time frame that we have.
Yes.
What is China doing with respect to the One Belt, One Road initiative? What is that, firstly? Let's start with that. What is it exactly? What is China thinking there?
So the One Belt, One Road initiative, which later on was actually renamed to the Belt and Road Initiative, was a campaign or a project started 10 years ago. We're going to celebrate the 10-year anniversary now, under Xi Jinping's leadership. And really is about how to offer, let's say, a different path of development focused on the global south. In the last 10 years, there's I believe over 100 countries now who have signed on to the Belt and Road Initiative, with most countries in terms of largest representation in Africa. When you look at a place like Africa that has been devastated for 500 years since the slave trade and then colonialism, we have basically, I believe what they have is $1 billion infrastructure deficit every year.
Africa as a whole.
Africa as a whole. 40% of the population don't have access to electricity.
You don't have to convince us on that. We know that. That's
so
absolutely true.
In terms of what happened after the neoliberal era in the 1980s and 90s, is that the options that the U.S.-led West gave our countries in terms of structural adjustment programs, in terms of the debt that we were burdened with, meant that we had to implement all kinds of neoliberal policies, and it was just mass suffering of the people. That's a story the whole global South knows about. In a way, the Belt and Road Initiative provides another option.
Yeah, it does.
It's about development that doesn't come with political strings. It doesn't come with a forced structural adjustment.
So you're not telling countries you need to implement X, Y, Z policy, you need to balance your budgets and trade deficits, etc. You're not telling people how to run their countries. Is that right?
Absolutely.
Okay. So you made the argument that China is socialist because the state does not actually respond to capitalism as a class. You have capitalists without necessarily having capitalism. And you made the argument that the One Belt, One Road initiative offers an alternative way for people to address their problems of development. Is this initiative in any way connected to or a response to the pivot to Asia policy that was adopted in around, between 2012, etc.?
Yeah, since the Obama period, deep into the trade war into Trump, and now we're in the phase of Biden, which is increasing this, let's call it, new Cold War strategy. In a way, I mean, I wouldn't say it's a response to. Certainly what we are seeing in this particular conjuncture is there's a decline in the U.S. hegemony over the world.
Okay.
In many aspects. We don't need to go into the sort of Ukraine war in much detail, but one of the things we did see is pretty much across the global south, there wasn't a sort of blind following of a U.S. agenda. There's a sense that their countries need to protect their own national sovereignty, and the U.S. assent is not in a time of assent. So, does China provide a different option? Do some people look towards China's model of modernization, which did not come at the cost of, starting endless wars, occupations of other countries? Maybe it is a kind of other path. Not a model to be replicated in any other place.
Okay.
But one of the things I think is really interesting, let's talk about the Belt and Road Initiative in Argentina, for example. The Argentina, in terms of their national project, has struck quite interesting deals under the Belt and Road Initiative with China that include a lot of technology transfer. For example, they're now developing some nuclear plants, nuclear energy plants, using Chinese technology, and that is sealed into the deal. There is a part of it in terms of the development of their lithium, because China, of course, has advanced in developing electric vehicles, the whole new energy transition, and that's something that they're also working in there. So this also really depends, I think, the onus for any of us who are leftists or in political movements or parties, it's beholden for the left within the country to push their own governments to set a national project.
Absolutely, and a more democratic national project.
Yes.
I totally agree with you.
And because China firmly believes, since the non-aligned period and the leadership of Zhou Enlai, our former prime minister, is that China doesn't want to intervene in the internal affairs of anyone. These are kind of sealed, tenets, really under the non-aligned moment. Is that China will not come in and resolve the problems within a government, within a state, and that's where the political and left forces have to play their part.
That's their role,
their
not China's
projects.
role.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can completely understand that. So a lot of people in Pakistan also ask us, or ask the left in general, about the Uyghur Muslims, because there were reports in the international media that perhaps up to 2 million people, which is a huge number, this is the size of the city of Faisalabad, were incarcerated or were in various camps, etc. And that they were in those camps because of their religious beliefs, i.e. because they're Muslims. So, any thoughts on that?
So I think one of the things we have to emphasize is China is actually a very diverse country. We have 55 ethnic groups officially. Of course, the majority are what we call Han people.
Yes.
Over 90% of us are. And the rest, the 54, are ethnic minorities. So the Uyghurs are one of the ethnic minorities. So mostly in the Xinjiang region. But let's not forget, too, that there are different Muslim ethnic minorities within
There are. I believe the Uyghurs are not even the largest ethnic.
The Hui people and a variety, and they don't get as focused on.
Right.
So one of the things in terms of, let's say, around 10, 15 years ago, and this is something I think China didn't really report very much, is the rise in Islamic fundamentalism in the region.
It was coming from Afghanistan, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes. And so there were
times... Even there were parts of Pakistan which were involved in that entire sort of movement of people.
Absolutely. And of course fomented by the West. We know this is one of the ways that it wants to control or destabilize the region. So in some parts, some points in let's say 10, 15 years ago, there were up to 3,000 attacks a year.
3,000 attacks a year?
And of course, there could be bombings to knife attacks, all kind of. We're talking.
And they were all over China?
All over Xinjiang.
All over Xinjiang?
Yes.
Okay. And just for the viewers, these were allegedly carried out by ITEM, which is the East Turkestan Islamic movement.
Yes. Which the U.S. used to call a terrorist organization, but then conveniently has.
Till a certain time.
Yeah, till a certain time.
Was ATEM the only organization, or were there others as well?
This was the key one.
This was the biggest one, probably. Okay.
So that's one of the things, we know that that entire region, the whole question of how to combat the rise of fundamentalism in many areas is a big challenge. So one of the things that the government did do is create vocational schools. And vocational schools aren't just in Xinjiang. We have vocational schools across the country, especially as a way to deal with poverty. Because we have to understand the rise of fundamentalism is also linked to your economic and social conditions. Why do people turn towards, and what is their why are they vulnerable to a certain radicalization? So so when we think about the experience as part of the alleviation, it's not distinct of what has happened in Xinjiang, where education, vocational training say, okay, trades, learn a trade, this is going to be part. And also part of sort of de-radicalization of
So this is, well, hang on, this is something new for me.
Yeah.
So you're saying these vocational schools were not just in Xinjiang, they're all over China?
We have vocational schools all over China. It's part of a
And it
school
was the
system.
same kind of schools that were there in Xinjiang?
I've never personally been to Xinjiang,
Right.
you know, and
Right.
that's I'll admit that.
Yeah.
The characteristics of the school will probably be different because
Sure.
the conditions are different.
Sure.
But they're mainly vocational schools.
They're not camps.
They're not camps. They're not prisons.
They're not prisons.
Yes.
They're not
And
gulags.
They're not genocidal places, you
I
know.
see.
And one of the things I think it's actually because there's a lot of I think misinformation about you know the genocide also happening, right? Not only incarceration but genocide or sterilization, you know, all kinds of things of Uyghurs. But one of the things is under the ethnic minority policies that were established since the Mao days, all the you know. Family planning policies,
Yes.
the one-child policies, did not actually apply to ethnic minorities.
Yeah,
So if you look in the region,
you mean the one-child policy does
Did
not
not apply to ethnic
never
minorities.
apply to any ethnic minority?
including Uyghur people. So you will see Uyghur people have a much higher birth rate than the rest.
Then the
of
Han
people.
Chinese.
And so that's another thing about, you know, we were comparing the genocidal, you know, reign of
cultural genocide.
yeah, and also, but during the Mao period, you look at the numbers, it doesn't add up. How could there be mass genocide at the same time we have a huge increase in birth
Interesting.
and
In
life
population
expectancy? And here
generally.
also, huge expense. I don't have the numbers fresh in my head, but they're readily available.
Well, I'm sure in 1949 the population of China was not 1.4 billion people.
Yes.
It's become that over
Yeah.
time, and
Yes.
that's only because perhaps because of rising prosperity
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
you know, better living conditions and political stability.
Yeah.
There's no wars going on, etc. All right, so this is very, very interesting and lots of very sort of new information for me. We need to continue this debate for
Sure.
a lot longer because naturally I think my audiences will not necessarily be convinced just by the few facts that we've discussed today.
Sure.
They need a lot more information on that. So finally, to conclude, how do Chinese people see us, Pakistan? I put things under a lot of pressure here, asked her a lot of questions, you know, put her fundamental beliefs into question here, perhaps. But I'm sure you get asked a lot of these questions. But
Sure.
now it's perhaps time for you to reverse the tables on me. How do Chinese people see Pakistanis? What is the overall impression?
You know, I would say most people in China probably know very little about Pakistan.
Okay.
I think most people, because the kind of state-to-state relations are good, and Pakistan has been a good friend of China for a long time, most people would be like they're, what do we call them? A steel brother, or you know, like a solid
friend.
Solid friend.
Right.
And of course, we know Pakistan played an important role in mediating this rapprochement between U.S. and China, and
I'm not too happy about that, but
no.
all right.
So I'm just saying, might be, when you're asking me the common person
Sure.
in China,
Yes,
these are
yes.
probably the things
I
they
get
think
it.
about.
I was just
But
making a joke.
unfortunately, probably a lot of ignorance. So maybe at some point we need to invite you to a show and tell the Chinese people more about Pakistan.
Well, I mean, I think part of the reason, of course, is the language barrier.
Yeah.
I mean, we hardly understand any Chinese, and I think Chinese people find it difficult to understand Urdu and
Yeah.
Punjabi and Sindhi and other languages of Pakistan, and that has to be overcome. And one way that we're, actually being able to overcome it is through English,
Yes.
which is neither your, sort of native language nor mine in that
Yes.
sense, but nonetheless, it's become an international language.
Yes.
My concern was more with respect to the question of extremism within Pakistan. There was, in the past, there was a horrific attack when certain engineers were attacked in Pakistan, very brutally by extremist organizations. And then there was another horrific attack in Karachi on the Confucian Center,
Yes.
where professors were attacked, teachers were attacked.
And more recently, at the hairstylist shop with
Yes.
it's actually Chinese Pakistanis, not the Pakistani nationals. But Chinese
Yes.
descent.
So I was wondering how has that colored people's perception? What has that done? I mean, I'm sure it hasn't done any good for us,
Yeah.
but how do people see that?
I would say, I mean, those are quite tragic stories. It's
course.
worrying. I wouldn't say this is a perception on Pakistan or Pakistani people, but surely it's reinforcing why it's absolutely necessary to help maintain stability. And thinking about, I think there's generally across China, there's a pretty strong support on how China has been able to handle the question of extremism within the country, knowing that it, has this experience as well. And so I don't know how to say in terms of what is the general. For people,
it's a huge country. Yeah,
have a lot of opinions.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, surely.
But what about in the press, etc., or in the media in China? Like for example, let me put the question into a broader context. I feel and I fear that the perception about Pakistanis and Pakistan in India, as well as in much of the West, is extremely negative. People, if they hear that someone is a Pakistani, the first thought that comes into their mind is he's going to have a big beard, he's going to have a turban, and he's going to have a suicide belt. Excuse me for saying this, but I mean, sadly, a lot of people have this kind of really warped image about what Pakistan is. I would hate to find out if that's also the case in China. Is it? Or
I really don't think that would be the case.
Okay.
I mean, I don't know. I don't think that would be the normal perception, especially because the state media and the sort of more official narrative paints Pakistan in a pretty positive light.
In a positive light.
So it is obviously when these cases happen, people will probably be concerned about security and etc.
Yeah.
But would not be singling out of Pakistan in that way.
As long as they understand that it's one section, problematic section of Pakistan,
Absolutely.
not Pakistan as a whole. I think
Absolutely.
that would be the Thank you so much for your time and for taking all my questions.
Yeah.
I put you on the spot. I apologize for that. But these are questions that people ask me, and they generally discuss.
Yeah.
How can viewers of this video, etc., get access to more information about China? You were mentioning your collective earlier. Maybe you want to...
Sure, absolutely. I mean, a few of us from different countries, actually, who are interested in geopolitics and the news and also in China, 3 years ago founded this Dongsheng Collective. We just all sort of part-time researchers with this. And so you can find us Dongsheng News on all the social media platforms, and we're basically just trying to provide information about China.
And that is spelled DONGSHENG.
Yes.
I'll put it down in the
So
description.
it's just to get some information because we realized that everywhere in the world was basically, even the left, even for socialists, was just relying on the line from DC or London or what BBC was saying about China. And there was not much information that was available. So we are just basically a compiler. We read a lot and try to offer that information.
Oh, wonderful. Do visit their website. That's the Dongsheng Collective. Things I want to say that I think there's a lot of people here who are viewing this video, and I think I speak on their behalf, that lots and lots of Pakistani students go to China, they study there, they study engineering and all sorts of medicine and all sorts of other things. And I would like to extend an invitation to you, to your friends, to come to Pakistan so that we can have such dialogues. And I think there's a lot of dialogue at the state-to-state level, but I think
people-to-people level.
Absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
I think it would be great to have people such as yourself and others come to Pakistan, talk to people in Pakistan, not at official dinners where everybody is very stiff,
Yes.
doesn't want to offend anyone, etc. So please accept my invitation and accept the invitation of everyone.
Absolutely.
We would love to host you in Pakistan.
It's my dream to go to Pakistan. So.
Wonderful to hear that. We would take you around to all the major cities, introduce you to
And the countryside
people.
too, please.
And the countryside. You can meet with people. I'll be your translator, etc. And we could meet with other progressive political parties and even mainstream political parties. Thank you so much for your time,
Thank you,
patience, and this conversation. All the best.
Thank you.